Hi and welcome to the Archive of History. It is just before dawn, and you are standing at the edge of an ancient harbor. The Mediterranean stretches before you like hammered bronze, its surface catching the first pale threads of light from the east. The air is cool and heavy with salt, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of cedar wood and something else, something strange and pungent. The smell of crushed sea snails and fermentation, the unmistakable signature of the dye works that have made this city wealthy beyond measure. Behind you, limestone buildings rise in terraced steps up the hillside, their whitewashed walls still gray in the pre-dawn darkness. You can hear the gentle slap of water against wooden hulls, the creak of rope and timber, and somewhere in the distance, the call of a temple priest greeting the rising sun. This is a Phoenician port, sometime around 900 BCE, and you are about to experience a civilization that shaped the ancient world in ways that still echo through our lives today. The Phoenicians. You may not immediately recognize the name, yet their legacy flows through the very words you are reading now. They gave humanity the alphabet, the foundation of nearly every written language in the Western world. They were master sailors who transformed the Mediterranean from a barrier into a highway, connecting distant peoples and cultures through networks of trade that stretched from the Levant to the Pillars of Hercules and perhaps beyond. They produced a color so rare and precious that it became the symbol of imperial power itself, Tyrian purple, the color that only emperors and kings could afford to wear. And yet, despite all they achieved, despite the indelible mark they left on human civilization, the Phoenicians themselves left almost no written records of their own history, their literature, their poetry, or their inner lives. What we know of them comes filtered through the eyes of others, through Greek historians and Roman conquerors, through archaeological fragments and the echoes they left in cities scattered across the Mediterranean world. Tonight we will journey back more than 3,000 years to walk among these remarkable people. We will smell the cedar forests of Lebanon, feel the spray of seawater on a merchant vessel pushing westward toward unknown shores, and witness the creation of purple dye in the stinking workshops of Tyre. We will explore their ingenious ships and revolutionary alphabet, follow their trade routes to the edges of the known world, and stand on the walls of their cities as empires rise and fall around them. This is a story of survival, innovation, and adaptation of a people who turned geographic disadvantage into maritime dominance, who had no choice but to look to the sea and in doing so, changed the course of history. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the concerns of the present day fade like morning mist over the water. Breathe slowly, relax, and let us travel back to a time when the Mediterranean was young and unknown, when wooden ships with purple sails pushed beyond the horizon in search of fortune, and when a narrow strip of coastline gave birth to one of history's most influential civilizations. The story of the Phoenicians begins not with a grand empire or a legendary founder, but with geography itself, with the simple, inescapable facts of land and sea that would shape their entire destiny. The land that gave birth to the Phoenicians was a paradox, beautiful yet cruel in its limitations. Imagine the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, that narrow ribbon of territory that corresponds roughly to modern Lebanon and coastal Syria. Here, the mountains press close to the sea, the Great Lebanon and Anti-Lebanon ranges rising abruptly just inland, their peaks crowned with snow even in summer. Between these imposing mountains and the endless Mediterranean, there exists only a thin coastal plain, rarely more than a few kilometers wide, sometimes vanishing entirely where rocky headlands plunge directly into the surf. This is not a land that invites easy agriculture or supports large populations through farming alone. The soil is thin, the arable land limited. There is no great river valley here like the Nile or the Euphrates, no vast plains for growing grain. What little flat land exists is broken into isolated pockets by rocky promontories and seasonal streams that carve their way down from the heights. For the people who lived here in the Late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE and after, this geography presented a stark choice. They could remain small, isolated farming communities, forever constrained by the limited land available, or they could turn their faces to the sea. The Mediterranean was vast, dangerous, and largely unknown, but it was also a frontier of unlimited possibility, where the land offered scarcity, the sea offered abundance, where the mountains created barriers, the sea created highways, and so, gradually, hesitantly at first, and then with growing confidence and skill, the people of this coast became sailors, fishermen, traders, and eventually the most accomplished mariners the ancient world would know. They did not call themselves Phoenicians. That name came later, given to them by the Greeks, derived from the word phoenix, which means purple or crimson. The Greeks knew these people primarily as the producers of that extraordinary purple dye, and so the name stuck, echoing down through the centuries. The people themselves would have identified with their individual cities as Tyrians from Tyre, Sidonians from Sidon, Giblites from Byblos. They spoke a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Aramaic, wrote in an early Canaanite script that they would later revolutionize, and worshipped gods and goddesses whose names echo through the pages of the Hebrew Bible as the deities of Canaan. Their cities clung to the coast like jewels on a string. To the north was Arwad, built on a small island just offshore, its position providing natural protection from land-based threats. Further south lay Byblos, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, its name giving us the Greek word for book, biblion, and eventually our word Bible. Then came Sidon, prosperous and ancient, known for its skilled craftsmen and its glass production. And greatest of all was Tyre, built partly on the mainland and partly on a rocky island, a short distance offshore, a city that would become synonymous with wealth, power, and maritime prowess. These were not empty harbors when the Phoenicians rose to prominence. People had lived here for thousands of years, trading with Egypt, exchanging goods with Mesopotamia, harvesting the sea and the sparse farmland. But something changed in the centuries around 1200 BCE. The great Bronze Age empires, the Hittites in Anatolia, the Mycenaeans in Greece, the powerful Egyptian New Kingdom, all faced a period of catastrophic collapse. Cities were burned, trade networks disrupted, and civilization itself seemed to teeter on the edge of darkness. Historians call this the Bronze Age collapse, and its causes remain debated, perhaps earthquakes, climate change, invasions by the mysterious sea peoples, or internal rebellions. Whatever the cause, the result was a power vacuum, and into that vacuum, the Phoenician city-states emerged. With the old powers weakened or gone, the coastal cities found themselves free to develop their own destiny. They had always been traders and skilled craftsmen, but now they could expand that role without the heavy hand of Egyptian or Hittite overlords demanding tribute and controlling their commerce. The timing was perfect. As the Mediterranean world slowly recovered from the chaos, there was desperate need for the goods and services the Phoenicians could provide. They had timber, cedar from the mountain forests, which Egypt and Mesopotamia desperately needed and would pay handsomely for. They had access to murex snails for purple dye. They had skilled artisans who could work glass, ivory, metal, and textile. And most importantly, they had the ships and the knowledge to connect the recovering civilizations, to carry goods from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, to serve as the essential middlemen in an increasingly interconnected world. You can almost feel the shift in those years, the gradual realization among the merchants and shipwrights of Tyre and Sidon that the sea was not just their escape route but their fortune. The mountains at their back were no longer a limitation but a blessing, for they forced these people to look outward, to develop skills that their landlocked neighbors would never master. In the harbors, new ships were being built, larger and more seaworthy than before. Along the docks, warehouses were filling with goods destined for distant ports. In the workshops, craftsmen were perfecting techniques that would make Phoenician products famous throughout the ancient world. And in the mountains above, woodsmen were felling the great cedars, those magnificent trees that grew nowhere else in such quality and abundance. The trees that would literally build the Phoenician future. The geography that seemed so limiting, that narrow strip between mountain and sea, became the crucible in which a unique culture was forged. The Phoenicians learned to read the moods of the Mediterranean, to navigate by sun and star, to judge the weather from the color of the dawn sky and the behavior of seabirds. They learned which beaches were safe for pulling up ships at night, and which hidden coves might shelter pirates. They learned the art of loading a ship so that it remained stable in heavy seas, and the science of preserving food and water for long voyages. They learned that information was as valuable as cargo, that knowing where copper could be mined in Cyprus, or where the Greeks needed olive oil, could mean the difference between a profitable voyage and a wasted journey. As the centuries passed, these scattered cities never unified into a single kingdom or empire. They remained fiercely independent, often competing with one another for trade routes and commercial advantage, sometimes even warring against each other. Yet they shared a common culture, a common language, and common gods. A merchant from Tyre would have felt at home in Sidon, recognized the same religious festivals, understood the same commercial practices, and spoken the same language. This combination of competition and cultural unity drove innovation. Each city wanted to outdo its rivals, to build better ships, produce finer goods, establish more distant colonies. The result was a civilization defined not by territorial conquest, but by commercial reach, not by armies and fortresses, but by ships and harbors. Standing in that harbor at dawn, watching the first merchants begin their day, you would have witnessed the beginning of something revolutionary. These people, constrained by geography and circumstance, were about to transform the Mediterranean from a barrier into a bridge, to carry not just goods but ideas, technologies and cultural practices across vast distances. They would establish trading posts and colonies that would eventually become major cities in their own right. They would develop new forms of writing and accounting. They would sail beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic, perhaps even circumnavigating Africa. And they would do all of this not as conquerors but as merchants, not through military might but through commercial genius and maritime skill. The land between sea and mountains was harsh, unforgiving, and limited. But from that limitation came adaptation, innovation, and ultimately, mastery of the greatest highway of the ancient world. The Phoenicians had no choice but to become sailors. That necessity, born of geography, became their greatest strength and their lasting legacy. Now let us climb into the mountains above the coastal cities, up steep paths where the air grows thinner and cooler, where the scent of the sea is gradually replaced by the rich, resinous perfume of the forest. Here in the highlands of Lebanon grew the trees that would become both sacred symbol and economic foundation of Phoenician civilization, the cedars of Lebanon. Even today the name carries a weight of ancient reverence, though only scattered remnants of those once vast forests remain. In their time these trees were legendary, celebrated in poetry and scripture, desired by every great king from Mesopotamia to Egypt. They were not merely trees but pillars connecting earth to heaven, living monuments that could grow for 1,000 years, reaching heights of 40 meters or more. Their massive trunks several meters in diameter, their spreading branches creating a canopy so dense that the forest floor beneath lay in perpetual shadow. To stand among these giants was to feel simultaneously humbled and exalted. The cedars did not grow in the lowlands but preferred the mountain slopes between about 1,300 and 3,000 meters elevation, where winter snows fed their roots and summer mists kept them from drought. Their wood was unlike any other available in the ancient Near East. It was strong yet relatively light, resistant to rot and insects due to the aromatic resins that permeated every fiber. It could be worked with bronze tools, carved and shaped without splitting or cracking. When properly dried and seasoned, it lasted for centuries. The scent alone was intoxicating, a clean, sharp fragrance that made cedar wood precious, not just for construction but for storage chests, temple doors, and the interiors of palaces where its perfume would persist for generations. For the Phoenicians, the cedar forests represented both spiritual heritage and economic opportunity. These trees were sacred, associated with the gods themselves, particularly with the deity Baal and the goddess Astarte. To fell a cedar required ritual preparation, offerings to ensure the forest's blessing, prayers that the harvest would not anger the divine forces that dwelled among the branches. Yet the practical needs were equally urgent. Egypt had no timber suitable for ship masts or large construction beams. Mesopotamia had only palm wood and imported timber at enormous cost. The Phoenician cities possessed virtually the only source of high-quality construction timber in the eastern Mediterranean world, and they knew it. The process of bringing a cedar from the forest to the coast was an enormous undertaking, requiring skill, strength, and coordination. First came the selection, walking through the forest to identify trees of the proper size and straightness, old enough that their wood was fully mature, but not so ancient that the heartwood had begun to rot. The felling was done in winter when the sap was low and the wood would be lightest. Teams of woodsmen would work for days on a single large tree, chipping away at the base with bronze axes, the rhythmic sound of metal on wood echoing through the forest. When the great tree finally began to crack and groan, when it tilted and then fell with a thunderous crash that shook the ground, there was both triumph and solemnity in the moment. A living thing that had stood since before the grandfathers of the woodsman had been born was now timber, raw material for human purposes. But felling the tree was only the beginning. The real challenge was transport. The mountains were steep, the paths barely wide enough for a man, certainly not for a massive tree trunk that might weigh several tons. The Phoenicians developed an ingenious system. They would trim the branches and cut the trunk into manageable sections, though even a section might still require dozens of men to move. Then they would wait for winter, for the snow and ice. When conditions were right, they would wrap the logs with ropes and harnesses and drag them onto wooden sledges. The ice-covered slopes became chutes down which the enormous logs would slide, controlled by teams of men with ropes acting as brakes, guiding the timber down the mountainside toward the coastal plain. It was dangerous, exhausting work. Men died when logs broke free and tumbled out of control, or when ropes snapped and the timber became a deadly projectile. But the profits were enormous enough to make the risk worthwhile. Once on the coastal plain, the timber would be transported to the cities, to the specialized shipyards, where master craftsmen would transform raw logs into vessels capable of crossing the open sea. The construction of a Phoenician ship was an art form refined over generations. Unlike the ships of Egypt, which were built for river use and had to be modified extensively for seagoing, Phoenician vessels were designed from the keel up for the Mediterranean's moods. The foundation was the keel, a single long timber of cedar, as straight and strong as could be found. Onto this, the ribs were attached, creating the skeleton of the ship. Then came the planking, each plank carefully shaped and fitted, attached to the ribs with wooden pegs and sealed with pitch to make the hull watertight. This was called shell-first construction, building the outer skin before adding internal structure, a technique that allowed for stronger, more flexible hulls. The Phoenicians developed several types of ships, each suited to different purposes. For warfare and speed, there was the galley, long and narrow, powered primarily by oars. The earliest versions had a single row of oarsmen on each side, but by the 8th century BCE, Phoenician shipwrights had perfected the biome, with 2 levels of rowers. This innovation doubled the power without significantly increasing the length of the ship, allowing for greater speed and maneuverability. These warships had a ram at the bow, bronze-covered or reinforced with hardwood, designed to punch through the hull of enemy vessels. They were sleek, predatory things, capable of short bursts of tremendous speed when the oarsmen pulled in unison. For trade, however, the Phoenicians used a very different design, the round ship or merchant vessel. These were broader and deeper, relying primarily on a single large square sail rather than oars, though they carried oars as well for maneuvering in and out of harbor. The round ship sacrificed speed for cargo capacity, with a deep hold that could carry amphorae of wine and oil, ingots of copper and tin, bales of textile, and all the varied goods of Mediterranean trade. These vessels had a rounded bow and stern, giving them their name, and a large steering oar mounted on one side near the stern. They were sturdy, stable, and seaworthy, capable of weathering the autumn storms that could turn the Mediterranean into a chaos of wind and wave. The shipbuilders themselves formed an elite class within Phoenician society. Their knowledge was precious, passed from master to apprentice, carefully guarded as trade secrets. A master shipwright could judge the quality of timber by eye and touch, could see in a rough log the shape of a keel or mast. They understood the stresses that waves and wind would place on every joint and seam. They knew that a ship had to be flexible enough to bend with the sea, but strong enough not to break, that too rigid a construction would result in a hull that cracked and leaked, while too loose would mean a vessel that twisted and fell apart. The launch of a new ship was a community event, blessed by priests, celebrated with feasting. The vessel would be painted and decorated, often with eyes on the bow to help it see its way across the water, and named, sometimes after a god or goddess, sometimes after a quality its owners hoped it would possess: swift, fortunate, stormbreaker. The wood for these ships came from those mountain forests, from trees that had been saplings when the Bronze Age was young, that had grown through centuries of sun and rain and snow, that had stood as silent witnesses to the rise and fall of empires. Now their wood would carry Phoenician merchants from Tyre to Egypt, from Sidon to Cyprus, from Byblos to Crete and beyond. The cedars of Lebanon, sacred and profitable, beautiful and useful, were the silent partners in Phoenician commercial success. They were the material foundation upon which a maritime empire was built, the physical substance that allowed an idea that the sea could be a highway rather than a barrier to become reality. In the shipyards along the coast, the sound of adzes shaping wood, the smell of hot pitch being applied to seal seams, the shouts of workers coordinating to lift a mast into place. These were the sounds and smells of Phoenician power being born. Every ship that slid down the beach into the surf, every vessel that raised its square sail and turned its painted eyes toward the western horizon, carried with it the strength of the cedar, the skill of the shipwright, and the accumulated knowledge of a people who had learned that mastery of the sea began with mastery of wood. The sacred groves and the busy shipyards were linked by more than proximity. They were two parts of a single system, the raw material and the craftsmanship, the gift of nature and the application of human ingenuity, working together to create the vessels that would carry Phoenician civilization across the ancient world. But the Phoenicians' reputation rested on more than just ships and cedar. There was another product, rare and precious beyond measure, that made their cities wealthy and gave them their Greek name. Imagine walking through the southern quarter of ancient Tyre toward the workshops that no visitor ever forgets, not because of what they see, but because of what they smell. The stench hits you while you are still several streets away, a powerful, nauseating odor that combines the reek of rotting fish with something sharper, more chemical, a smell that seems to coat the inside of your nose and throat and lingers in your clothing for days afterward. This is the dye district, where the most valuable color in the ancient world is produced, where the humblest raw material, sea snails, is transformed through labor and secret knowledge into Tyrian purple, the color that kings and emperors will literally pay a fortune to possess. The source of this incredible wealth was humble enough, a sea snail of the murex family that lived in the shallow waters along the Phoenician coast. There were several species that could be used, Murex brandaris and Murex trunculus being the most important. And all of them shared a peculiar characteristic. Deep within their bodies, in a small gland, they produced a secretion that, when exposed to sunlight and air, would slowly transform from yellowish or greenish white to a stunning shade of purple red. This was not a dye that could be easily harvested or quickly produced. It required an industrial process of remarkable sophistication and, more than anything, an almost unbelievable quantity of snails. Ancient sources suggest that it took roughly 12,000 murex snails to produce just 1.4 grams of pure dye, barely enough to color the trim of a single garment. The color that made Tyre famous was built on a foundation of millions upon millions of crushed snails. The harvesting of murex was seasonal work, carried out primarily in the autumn when the snails were most abundant. Divers and fishermen would work the rocky shallows, using baited traps or simply collecting by hand, gathering the snails into baskets that were then transported to the dye works. In Tyre, these workshops were concentrated in a specific area, partly to contain the smell and partly because the process required access to large quantities of seawater. The first step was extraction. The snails had to be cracked open and the tiny hyperbranchial gland removed. This was painstaking work, done by specialists who could identify and extract the precious gland quickly and without crushing it. The discarded shells and flesh of the snails accumulated in enormous heaps. Archaeological excavations in Tyre and Sidon have uncovered middens of crushed murex shells several meters deep, physical evidence of the industrial scale of the operation. Once extracted, the glands were placed in large vats, enormous ceramic or stone containers that could hold hundreds of liters. To the glands was added seawater and sometimes salt, and then the vats were left in the sun, covered but with small openings to allow air circulation. What happened next was both chemistry and something that must have seemed like magic to ancient observers. The mixture began to ferment, bacterial action breaking down the organic material, while the dye precursors in the gland secretions underwent a complex transformation. The vats would bubble and foam, and the smell, already unpleasant, intensified into something truly overwhelming. Ancient writers compared it to the stench of death itself. Workers in the dye houses lived with this smell every day, their skin stained, their clothes permanently discolored, their very bodies marked by their trade. The fermentation process took days, sometimes more than a week, and required constant monitoring. The temperature had to be carefully controlled. the mixture stirred at regular intervals, the progression of the color checked. Too much heat or too little, too long or too short a fermentation time, and the resulting color would be wrong, brownish or too pale, unsuitable for the premium market. The masters of this craft knew by experience, and probably by some trade secrets, passed down through families exactly when the dye liquor was ready. The liquid in the vats would have transformed from cloudy yellowish to deep purple red, though the color was never stable in the vat itself. The true test came when cloth was dipped into the dye. Textiles to be dyed, usually wool but sometimes linen, had to be prepared, cleaned and often mordanted, treated with substances like alum that would help the fabric accept and hold the dye. Then came the dyeing itself, immersing the fabric in the vat, pulling it out, exposing it to sunlight. And here was the true magic of Murex dye. The cloth emerged from the vat, looking yellowish or greenish, disappointing, apparently failed. But as the fabric hung in the sun, as the light and air worked their chemical transformation, the color would slowly deepen, intensifying through various shades, until it reached that distinctive purple red that could be achieved no other way. The process was called photoreduction, though the Phoenicians knew nothing of chemistry in modern terms. They simply knew that the sun called forth the color, that patience and light were as necessary as the snails themselves. The exact shade could be varied somewhat, by using different species of murex, by adjusting the fermentation time, by the number of dye baths a fabric underwent. The craftsman could produce colors ranging from reddish purple to deep bluish purple. The finest and most expensive was a deep purple with a slight red cast, the color that came to be called Tyrian purple specifically, though related shades produced in Sidon and other cities were also highly prized. Multiple dye baths could intensify the color to an almost black depth, producing what the Romans would call purple twice dyed, the most expensive fabric in the ancient world. Why was this color so valuable? Part of the answer was practical. Murex purple was extraordinarily color-fast, resistant to fading from sunlight or washing, permanent in a way that almost no other ancient dye could match. A garment dyed with Tyrian purple could last for decades, the color barely dimming. But the real answer was economic and social. The sheer difficulty of production, the enormous number of snails required, the skill and labor involved, made the dye extremely rare and therefore expensive. A pound of purple dyed wool could cost more than its weight in silver. Only the very wealthy could afford garments dyed completely in this color, and so purple became associated with status, power, and royalty. Kings wore purple, high priests wore purple, and no one else dared to, not because the dye itself was forbidden, but because it was simply beyond the means of ordinary people. This association between purple and power spread throughout the ancient world. The Phoenicians' monopoly on the production meant that anyone who wanted to display their status through this color had to buy from Tyre or Sidon or one of the other Phoenician cities. Egyptian pharaohs, Assyrian kings, later Persian emperors and Roman senators, all depended on Phoenician dyeworks for the color that symbolized their authority. The economic power this gave to the Phoenician cities was immense. It was a luxury good that couldn't be substituted or easily counterfeited, a product that the powerful had to have, regardless of price. The stinking workshops of Tyre, those places no respectable person would want to live near, were generating wealth that would fund fleets, build temples, and make the merchant princes of the city as rich as any kings. The workers who labored in the dye houses were far from wealthy themselves. This was hard, unpleasant work, low in social status despite its economic importance. Many were slaves or indentured laborers, people with no choice about their occupation, yet they possessed skills that were genuinely valuable, knowledge of precise timing and technique, experience that could make the difference between a batch of dye that would fetch premium prices and one that was barely marketable. The contradiction was sharp. The most prestigious color in the world produced by some of the lowliest workers, beauty and luxury, created in workshops that stank of death and decay. As you walked away from the dye district back toward the cleaner air of the harbor and marketplace, the smell would gradually fade though never entirely leave your clothing. But if you look back at those workshops, at the vats steaming gently in the sun, at the workers moving between them with their stained hands and tired faces, you would have been looking at one of the economic engines of the Phoenician world. The murex snail, unremarkable in life, had become in death the source of a color that made Tyre legendary. The purple sails that Phoenician ships hoisted as they left harbor, the purple-trimmed robes of wealthy merchants, the purple textiles that filled the warehouses waiting to be shipped to distant markets, all of it traced back to these workshops, to the patient, skilled, unpleasant labor of extracting color from the sea. The Phoenicians had taken something common, something that literally washed up on every beach, and through ingenuity and relentless effort, had transformed it into one of the most desired commodities on earth. That ability to see value where others saw only raw materials, to envision markets and products, to connect resources to needs, was perhaps their true genius, more important even than their ships or their alphabet. And nowhere was that genius more visible or more olfactory than in the purple dye workshops of Tyre. Let us now walk through a Phoenician city at the height of its prosperity, say Tyre in the 8th century BCE, and experience what daily life felt like in these maritime merchant states. You arrive just as dawn is breaking, the sun climbing above the eastern hills and transforming the limestone buildings from grey to gold. The city is already stirring. Unlike farming communities that wake with the sun, port cities operate on the rhythms of tide and wind, and many people have been awake for hours, preparing for the day's commerce. The harbor is the heart of everything. As you approach the waterfront, the air fills with a symphony of human activity. Ship crews are loading and unloading cargo, shouting to coordinate the lifting of heavy amphorae filled with wine or oil. Longshoremen carry sacks of grain on their shoulders, moving in long lines between ship and warehouse like columns of ants. The harbor master, an important city official, stands on the dock making notes on a clay tablet, recording each vessel, its cargo, and the customs duties owed to the city. Beside him, inspectors examine goods, checking quality, verifying weights, ensuring that merchants are not trying to cheat either the city or their trading partners. The smell is complex, salt water and fish, yes, but also the scents of distant places, the cedar and pine resin from ships, spices from some vessel just arrived from the east, the distinct smell of fresh-cut leather and new rope. The ships themselves are magnificent up close. Their hulls are painted often with protective eyes to ward off evil and help the vessel see its way across the water. The larger merchant vessels sit low in the water when fully loaded, their single mast supporting a broad square sail currently furled. Some are being careened, pulled up onto the beach and rolled onto their sides so that the hull can be cleaned of barnacles and seaweed, a necessary maintenance that every ship requires every few months. The smaller fishing boats are already returning from their night's work, their holds full of the morning's catch that will fill the city's markets within the hour. Moving inland from the harbor, you enter the commercial district, a maze of narrow streets lined with shops and workshops. The buildings are built of limestone blocks, 2 or 3 stories high, with the ground floor open to the street as a shop while the family lives in the rooms above. The streets are barely wide enough for 2 people to pass if they are carrying loads, designed for foot traffic and donkeys, not for carts. The buildings press close, providing shade during the heat of the day, though also trapping the smells and sounds of urban life. Here is a potter's workshop, where the craftsman sits at his wheel, foot pushing the stone wheel into motion, while his hands shape a large amphora with practiced ease. These vessels are crucial to Phoenician trade, the containers in which wine, oil, grain, and countless other products are shipped. Each city and sometimes each workshop has its own distinctive style, so that archaeologists centuries later will be able to identify where a given amphora was made. Next door, a metal worker has his furnace going early, the heat already intense as he melts bronze to pour into molds for tools and weapons. The specialization of labor is remarkable. You pass shops selling only rope, only sailcloth, only the bronze fittings that ships require. Other shops specialize in domestic goods, cooking pots, oil lamps, jewelry, carved ivory, cosmetic boxes. The market square is a riot of humanity. Here farmers from the hinterland have brought what little surplus their difficult land produces, vegetables and fruits, eggs and cheese. Fishermen sell their catch, the fish still flopping in baskets. Merchants display textiles, some dyed in the famous purple, others in reds and blues produced by cheaper methods. There are slaves for sale too, brought from distant wars or captured by pirates, standing silent and defeated while potential buyers examine them like livestock. The currency in use is primarily weighed silver, sometimes in the form of coins, but more often just pieces of metal that are weighed on balance scales to determine value. Every significant transaction involves negotiation, testing the quality of goods, checking weights, haggling over price. The noise is constant, vendors calling out their wares, buyers arguing for better prices, children running through the crowd, beggars pleading for charity. The social hierarchy is clearly visible in how people dress and carry themselves. At the top are the merchant princes, the heads of the great trading families who control much of the city's commerce. They wear fine linen robes, often with purple trim, gold jewelry at their necks and wrists, and they move through the city with the confidence of wealth and power. These men serve on the city's council, make the important decisions about trade policy, diplomatic relations and defense. They own the largest ships, maintain warehouses full of goods, and have business relationships that span the Mediterranean. Their homes are substantial buildings in the better parts of the city, with courtyards, multiple rooms, and sometimes upper stories that catch the sea breeze. Below them are the skilled craftsmen and smaller merchants, respected for their abilities, but without the wealth and influence of the elite. These are the people who actually make the goods that Phoenician traders carry across the sea, the workers who turn raw materials into finished products, who possess knowledge that took years to acquire and cannot be easily replicated. A master ship's carpenter, a skilled glassworker, a dye master who knows exactly when a batch is ready. These men have steady employment and relative prosperity, though they will never be wealthy. They are property owners, heads of households, citizens with a voice in certain city decisions, if not the most important ones. Then there are the common laborers, the men who load and unload ships, who work in the fields outside the city, who carry water and sweep streets and perform the 1,000 other tasks that keep urban life functioning. They own little more than their labor and their families. Life for them is precarious, dependent on daily work for daily bread, vulnerable to injury, illness, or simply the seasonal fluctuations in trade that might leave them without employment. They live in crowded quarters, multiple families sharing buildings, eating simple food, wearing simple clothes. At the bottom are the slaves, people without legal personhood, property of their masters, used for domestic service, heavy labor, or skilled work if they possess valuable knowledge. Slavery in the Phoenician world, as throughout the ancient Near East, was a common institution, though perhaps not as central to the economy as it would become later in Greece and Rome. Slaves could sometimes purchase their freedom or be freed by their masters, and the children of freed slaves might gradually integrate into the free population. Still, to be a slave was to have no control over your own life, to be vulnerable to the whims and violence of masters who had absolute legal power over you. The role of women in Phoenician society was complex and varied by class. Elite women managed large households, supervised slaves, arranged marriages for their children, and sometimes participated in business through family connections, though always in the name of male relatives. There is evidence that some women owned property and engaged in trade, particularly widows who inherited their husbands' businesses. Women worked in textile production, an essential and respected occupation. In every household, women spun thread, wove cloth, and created the fabrics that clothed their families and filled the cargo holds of merchant ships. The finest textiles, including purple-dyed garments, were often the products of women's skilled labor. Religion permeated daily life in ways that might seem foreign to modern sensibility. The gods were not distant abstractions but present forces, intimately involved in human affairs. The supreme god of most Phoenician cities was Baal, whose name simply means lord or master, a storm god associated with rain, fertility, and the seasonal cycles that determined agricultural success. Beside him stood Astarte, goddess of fertility, love, and war, a powerful female deity who commanded deep devotion. Each city also had its own particular patron deity. Tyre especially honored Melkart, a form of Baal associated specifically with the city and its maritime activities. The temples were among the most impressive buildings in any Phoenician city, built of fine stone and decorated with expensive materials. To enter a temple was to enter sacred space, literally the house of a god. The main sanctuary contained the cult statue, the physical representation of the deity's presence. Most people never entered this inner sanctum, which was the preserve of priests, but the temple courtyards were busy places, filled with people bringing offerings, seeking oracles, or simply participating in the community life that centered around religious observances. Religious practice involved regular sacrifices, the burning of incense, the offering of food and wine to the gods. Animal sacrifice was common. Sheep and goats primarily, though wealthier individuals might sacrifice bulls. The meat from these sacrifices was not wasted. After the divine portion, specific parts was burned for the gods, the rest was often distributed to worshippers or sold, providing protein for the community. On festival days, the whole city participated in processions and celebrations. The statue of the god might be carried through the streets in a sacred boat or carried on poles, accompanied by priests, musicians, and the entire population following behind, singing hymns and making offerings. There is evidence, controversial and debated, that in times of extreme crisis, some Phoenician cities practiced child sacrifice, the offering of one's own child to the gods in hopes of averting disaster. Archaeological sites associated with the Phoenician colony of Carthage contain burial grounds, called tophets, with the remains of very young children, sometimes with inscribed stones suggesting they were offered to the gods. Whether this was regular practice, emergency response, or something else entirely remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is clear is that the Phoenicians, like all ancient peoples, believed that their survival and prosperity depended on maintaining the favor of the gods, and they were willing to make costly offerings to ensure that favor. As evening approached, the character of the city changed. The harbor grew quieter as work ceased for the day. The shops closed, merchants counting their silver and securing their goods. Families gathered for the evening meal, sitting on the floors or at low tables, eating bread and olive oil, fish or mutton, vegetables seasoned with herbs, wine mixed with water. As darkness fell, the streets emptied. Without street lighting beyond the occasional oil lamp at a doorway, the city became a network of shadows and uncertain paths. Most people stayed home after dark, and those who moved through the nighttime streets did so warily, alert for danger. The city gates closed at nightfall, protecting the community from outside threats while trapping inside whatever darkness the night might bring. This was the rhythm of life in a Phoenician city, structured by commerce and shaped by the sea, hierarchical and religious, prosperous yet precarious. For the wealthy merchant watching ships depart for distant ports, the future was full of possibility. For the slave loading cargo onto those same ships, the future was simply another day of labor. For the sailor preparing to leave family behind for months at sea, the future was uncertain, measured in the distance to the horizon and the favor of the gods. Yet all were bound together in this small stone city, balanced between mountain and sea, participating in an enterprise that was gradually transforming the Mediterranean world. But how did these sailors actually navigate the Mediterranean? That vast expanse of water with no landmarks, no roads, nothing but open sea and distant horizons. Let us join a Phoenician merchant vessel as it prepares to leave the harbor of Sidon, bound for Cyprus with a cargo of cedar timber and purple cloth, and experience what ancient seafaring was truly like. The captain is a man named Hanno, a name common among Phoenician sailors, meaning gracious in their language. He has made this run dozens of times, knows the route as well as any man alive, yet he still performs the rituals carefully before departure. First, offerings at the temple of Melkart, protector of sailors, burning incense and pouring wine on the altar while whispering prayers for safe passage and favorable winds. Then inspection of the ship itself, walking the deck, checking every rope and piece of gear, running his hands along critical joints, looking for any sign of weakness or damage that might spell disaster once they are beyond sight of land. The ship is a broad-bellied merchant vessel, about 20 meters long and 6 meters wide, with a deep hold already loaded with its precious cargo. The single mast rises from the center of the deck, supporting a large square sail made of closely woven linen, though for now the sail is furled. A crew of perhaps 15 men will sail this ship, far fewer than would be needed for a galley of similar size, since they rely on wind rather than oars. At the stern, a large steering oar is mounted, not a rudder in the modern sense, but a long oar that can be angled to push the water and turn the ship. The helmsman who controls this must have strong arms and constant attention, fighting the sea's pressure for hours at a time. The departure is timed carefully. They will leave in early morning after the land breeze has faded, but before the afternoon wind picks up. The route to Cyprus is roughly west by north, about 160 kilometers of open water, a journey that in good conditions will take perhaps 2 days and a night. The ship is pushed away from the dock, the crew using long poles to maneuver through the crowded harbor until they reach open water. Then the sail is raised, the crew hauling on lines in coordinated effort, singing a work chant to keep their pulling synchronized. The linen sail fills with wind, and the ship begins to move, picking up speed as it clears the harbor mouth and feels the full strength of the breeze. Now comes the true test of the navigator's skill. In an age before the compass, before accurate maps, before any of the instruments later sailors would take for granted, how do you find your way across open sea? The Phoenicians developed a system of navigation based on detailed observation, accumulated knowledge, and a deep understanding of the natural world. The foundation was celestial navigation, using the sun and stars to determine direction and approximate position. During the day, the sun's arc across the sky provided a reliable east-west reference. The captain and his senior crew knew precisely where the sun should be at different times of day in different seasons. A shadow stick, a simple vertical post casting a shadow on a marked surface, could give rough time and direction simultaneously. But it was the night sky that provided the most reliable navigation. The Phoenicians were among the first peoples to systematically use the stars for maritime navigation, and they became so famous for this skill that the Greeks called the constellation we know as Ursa Minor, the Little Bear, by the name Phoenician star. The key star in this constellation is Polaris, the North Star, which sits almost directly above the Earth's northern axis, and therefore appears stationary while all other stars rotate around it throughout the night. Unlike the other stars, Polaris does not rise and set, but remains fixed at a constant angle above the horizon, an angle that corresponds directly to your latitude. A sailor who could measure the angle of Polaris above the horizon knew how far north or south he was with reasonable accuracy. The measurement was done by eye and hand. Hold your fist at arm's length, and it covers about 10 degrees of the sky. By stacking fists vertically from the horizon to Polaris, a trained observer could estimate the angle and therefore his latitude. This method seems crude but could be remarkably accurate in practiced hands. The Phoenicians knew that Sidon lay at about 4.5 fists, while Cyprus was at about 3.5 fists. If Polaris was rising higher than expected, they had drifted north and needed to adjust their course. If it was lower, they were too far south. Other stars and constellations provided directional reference. The constellation we call Orion rises in the east and sets in the west, maintaining a consistent path regardless of season. The Pleiades, a tight cluster of stars, were used as a seasonal marker, their position indicating the time of year and appropriate sailing weather. The Phoenicians developed a detailed astronomical knowledge, not as abstract science but as practical necessity. Every experienced sailor could identify dozens of stars and knew their movements through the seasons. This knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship, young sailors learning from veterans, watching the night sky, memorizing the patterns and positions that would one day save their lives. But celestial navigation was only part of the system. Equally important was what we might call environmental navigation, reading the sea itself for information about position and direction. The color of the water changed in different regions and depths. Near shore, in shallow water, the sea had a pale greenish cast. Deep water was darker blue. An experienced sailor could judge approximate depth by color, important knowledge when approaching an unfamiliar coast. The motion of the waves carried information too. Waves reflected off distant landmasses, creating interference patterns that a skilled observer could detect and interpret, sometimes alerting a navigator to the presence of land still below the horizon. Birds were crucial navigational aids. Most seabirds do not venture far from land, so the presence of certain species indicated proximity to shore. The direction birds flew at dawn and dusk, heading out to feeding grounds or returning to roosting sites, could point toward land. Some Phoenician ships apparently carried caged birds that could be released in open water. If the bird flew in a consistent direction, the crew would follow, reasoning that the bird's instinct would lead toward land. If the bird simply circled the ship and eventually landed back on deck, it meant land was too far away to be sensed, and the ship was truly in the middle of nowhere. The wind itself carried information. Different winds came from different directions with distinctive characteristics. The Phoenicians knew the seasonal patterns, knew which winds blew in summer and which in winter, which brought rain and which brought clear skies. They had names for these winds, tracking them as carefully as any modern meteorologist. Cloud formations were read for signs of coming weather. A mackerel sky, those high thin clouds that look like fish scales, often preceded a change in weather. A ring around the moon meant rain was coming. Dark clouds building on the horizon in certain patterns meant a storm was approaching, time to seek shelter or batten down and prepare for rough seas. Dead reckoning was another essential technique. The navigator kept a continuous mental account of the ship's position based on speed, direction, and time elapsed. Speed was judged by experience, watching the water pass the hull, noting how quickly floating debris was left behind, feeling the wind and the ship's motion. Direction was maintained by sun and star sightings, corrected constantly. Time was estimated by the sun's position, the changing of the watch, the counting of songs or prayers that marked the hours. Put all these together and a skilled navigator could maintain a reasonably accurate track of the ship's position, even without reference to land. Coastal navigation was easier and preferred whenever possible. The Phoenicians were masters of pilotage, the art of navigating by landmarks. They knew every headland, every distinctive mountain peak, every harbor entrance along their regular routes. They passed this information down through oral tradition and possibly through early charts, though no Phoenician maps survive. A pilot would describe a route to an apprentice: sail west until you see the Twin Peaks, then turn south toward the White Cliffs. When you see the temple on the headland, the harbor entrance is just beyond. This intimate knowledge of the coastline made navigation far more precise than open sea navigation could ever be. But sometimes there was no choice except to cross open water, and then the navigator relied on all his skills, all his accumulated knowledge, and a good measure of faith in the gods. The passage from Sidon to Cyprus that our ship is making is relatively short, but in poor visibility or if blown off course by storms, even a short passage could become dangerous. The crew keeps watches day and night, always someone at the steering oar, always lookouts scanning for other ships, floating debris, birds, any sign that might warn of danger or indicate position. The sail is adjusted constantly to catch the best wind. If the wind fails completely, the crew breaks out the oars and rows, back-breaking labor when pushing a laden merchant ship, but better than drifting helplessly. At night, with the ship plowing through dark water under a canopy of stars, the experience is simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The bioluminescence in the water creates trails of light where the bow cuts through, where the steering oar drags behind. The stars seem impossibly bright, the Milky Way a river of light overhead. But the sea is utterly dark and anything could be out there: rocks, enemy ships, creatures of the deep. The crew sleeps in shifts, huddled on deck or in the small shelter at the stern, never quite warm enough, never quite dry, always in motion as the ship rises and falls with the swells. After a day and a half of sailing, the lookout calls out. There, on the horizon, a dark line that gradually resolves into land. Cyprus. The navigator has brought them true, and the whole crew feels the relief. Coastal navigation takes over for the final approach, identifying landmarks, finding the harbor entrance, finally bringing the ship safely to dock where the cargo can be unloaded and new cargo taken on for the return journey. Another voyage completed, another demonstration that the sea, though dangerous and unpredictable, can be mastered by those with skill, knowledge, and courage. This system of navigation, built on observation and experience rather than instruments and technology, served the Phoenicians extraordinarily well. It allowed them to range far beyond the coasts, to cross open water with confidence, to establish trade routes that spanned the Mediterranean. Their reputation as the finest sailors of the ancient world was well earned, built not on any single technique but on a comprehensive understanding of the maritime environment. They read the sea as a farmer reads the land, as a craftsman reads his material, with intimate knowledge born of necessity and refined through generations of experience. The ability to navigate reliably, to find their way home from distant ports, was as fundamental to Phoenician success as their ships, their dye, or their cedar wood. Without it, they would have been confined to coastal waters, just one more small maritime culture. With it, they became the masters of the Mediterranean, capable of going anywhere there was profit to be made and courage to attempt the journey. Yet for all their maritime prowess and commercial success, the Phoenicians' greatest and most enduring legacy was not a product they sold or a route they discovered, but something far more fundamental. It was a revolutionary approach to writing that would eventually give rise to nearly every alphabet used in the world today. To understand the magnitude of this innovation, we must first understand the problem it solved. In the ancient Near East of the 2nd millennium BCE, writing was a specialized skill possessed by a small elite of trained scribes. The dominant writing systems were either cuneiform, used in Mesopotamia, or hieroglyphics, used in Egypt. Both were extraordinarily complex. Cuneiform consisted of hundreds of different symbols, each made by pressing a wedge-shaped stylus into soft clay. Some symbols represented entire words, others represented syllables, and a few represented phonetic sounds. To become literate in cuneiform required years of education, memorizing hundreds of signs and their various meanings and combinations. It was a system that worked, that preserved laws and literature, accounts and treaties, but it was cumbersome and inaccessible to anyone without extensive training. Egyptian hieroglyphics were similarly complex, with hundreds of characters that could represent words, syllables, or sounds depending on context. There were also two simplified cursive versions, hieratic and demotic, but even these remained complicated systems requiring professional scribes to master. For merchants, this complexity was a problem. Trade requires record-keeping, contracts, invoices, correspondence, all the documentary foundation of commercial activity. But if only specialized scribes could read and write, then every transaction required hiring someone with those skills, someone who became a bottleneck in business operations. What the Phoenicians needed, what their commercial culture demanded, was a writing system that was simple enough that an ordinary merchant could learn it without years of study, efficient enough that it could be written quickly, and flexible enough to represent the sounds of their language accurately. The solution they developed, probably sometime in the middle of the second millennium BCE, was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than having symbols represent words or syllables, what if each symbol represented just a single consonant sound? The Phoenician language, like other Semitic languages, placed heavy emphasis on consonants, with vowels often being supplied by the speaker from context. A system that captured just the consonantal skeleton of words would be readable to anyone familiar with the language. The breakthrough was creating a small set of easily drawn symbols, each corresponding to a single consonant sound. The number of symbols needed, just 22. 22 simple characters could capture anything that could be said in Phoenician. Let that sink in for a moment. Instead of hundreds or thousands of complex signs, just 22. A child could learn them in days or weeks rather than years. A merchant could keep his own records without hiring a scribe. A ship captain could write messages home. The democratization of literacy was not the goal. The Phoenicians were practical merchants, not social reformers, but it was the inevitable result. When writing becomes accessible, knowledge becomes accessible, and power structures begin to shift. The symbols themselves were simple linear forms, easy to scratch onto pottery, carve into stone, or write with ink on papyrus or leather. Each was based on a simple image whose name began with the sound it represented. A mnemonic device that aided learning. Aleph, meaning ox, represented the glottal stop sound and was drawn as a simplified ox head. Beth, meaning house, represented the B sound and was drawn as a simple house shape. Gamel, meaning throwing stick, represented the G sound. The pattern continued through all 22 letters, from Aleph to Tor. This consonantal alphabet spread rapidly throughout the Phoenician trading network because it was supremely practical. Merchants in Phoenician colonies from Cyprus to Sardinia used it. Local populations that traded with the Phoenicians adapted it to their own languages. The most important adaptation occurred when the Greeks encountered the system, probably through trade contacts in the 8th century BCE. The Greeks took the Phoenician alphabet and made a crucial modification. Where Phoenician represented only consonants, Greek added vowels, using some of the Phoenician letters whose sounds did not exist in Greek to represent vowel sounds instead. This Greek alphabet, with both consonants and vowels explicitly written, became the ancestor of the Latin alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet, and dozens of other writing systems. The debt is visible in the very names and forms of the letters. Phoenician Aleph became Greek Alpha. Beth became Beta, giving us the word alphabet itself from the first two letters. Gimel became Gamma. The forms of the letters evolved, but the ancestry is clear. When you write the letter A, you are using a descendant of the Phoenician Aleph, that stylized ox head turned upside down over millennia of copying and transformation. The Roman alphabet that you are reading now, the script used for English and dozens of other languages, is a direct descendant of the Phoenician innovation, filtered through Greek and Latin, but preserving at its core that original insight that you could represent speech with a small set of simple phonetic symbols. The irony is profound and tragic. The Phoenicians created this writing system, perfected it, spread it throughout the Mediterranean world, and yet they left almost no written record of themselves. We have Phoenician inscriptions, short texts mostly on stone or pottery, dedicatory inscriptions in temples, funerary texts, a handful of letters and contracts. But we have no Phoenician literature, no epic poems, no histories, no philosophical texts. If they created such things, and surely they must have, they have not survived. The writings were probably on perishable materials, papyrus or leather, which decomposed over the centuries, or perhaps they were deliberately destroyed, burned in the many conquests and sacks that their cities endured. Or maybe Phoenician culture was primarily oral, with written texts used mainly for commerce and religious purposes, rather than for preserving stories and ideas. What we have lost is incalculable. The Phoenicians voyaged throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. They encountered countless peoples and cultures. They had 3,000 years of history, of triumphs and disasters, heroes and villains, wisdom and folly. All of that lived in their collective memory, and presumably in their stories, poems and songs, and nearly all of it is gone, filtered to us only through the writings of others, usually Greeks and Romans who viewed the Phoenicians as commercial rivals, and sometimes enemies, whose accounts are colored by prejudice and incomplete knowledge. The Greeks called them Phoenicians, and knew them as skilled sailors and shrewd merchants. They appear in Greek literature as minor characters, the purple traders, the distant voyagers. Homer mentions them in the Odyssey, as accomplished craftsmen and notorious kidnappers. Herodotus credits them with circumnavigating Africa, though he admits he doesn't quite believe the story himself. Ironically, the detail he found most unbelievable, that the sun was on the northern side of the sky during part of the journey, is actually proof that the journey really happened, as that is exactly what you would see when sailing around southern Africa. But these Greek accounts tell us what the Phoenicians did, not who they were. Their inner lives, their literature, their own perspectives on their history, all of that is silent. Imagine if we knew English culture only through the writings of its historical enemies. If all of Shakespeare and Milton and Austen were lost, and we had only what French or Spanish chroniclers chose to say about the English. That is roughly the situation with the Phoenicians. We can reconstruct their trade routes, analyze their artifacts, excavate their cities, but we cannot hear their voices. The people who gave the world the very tool of written communication, who made literacy accessible to ordinary people, who created a system so effective that it is still the basis of writing for billions of people, those people themselves remain largely silent in history. There are tantalizing hints of what we have lost. Ancient Greek and Roman writers occasionally mention Phoenician books and learning. There was apparently a Phoenician work by a priest named Sanchuniathon that preserved ancient religious and historical traditions. It survived only in fragments quoted by later Greek writers, and even those fragments are considered by modern scholars to be probably corrupted or adapted. There may have been travel accounts, logs of voyages to distant places, commercial records that contained a wealth of geographic and ethnographic information. There may have been poetry, religious texts, philosophical speculation. We simply do not know. What remains is their linguistic legacy. The alphabet they created proved so superior to the writing systems that preceded it that it gradually replaced them. Cuneiform and hieroglyphics. Those complex systems that required years of training slowly faded from use as alphabetic writing spread. The last cuneiform texts were written in the 1st century CE. Hieroglyphics survived somewhat longer, but by the 4th century CE, no one could read them. It would take the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and decades of scholarly work in the 19th century to crack the code and allow us to read those ancient texts again. But the Phoenician alphabet never needed to be rediscovered. It evolved, adapted, spread, but it never died. It is alive today in nearly every alphabet used worldwide. When you write an email, when you text a friend, when you type these words, you are using a direct descendant of the Phoenician innovation. The symbols have changed form, the system has been adapted and modified, vowels added, new letters created for sounds that did not exist in ancient Phoenician. But the core insight, the fundamental approach of representing speech with a small set of phonetic symbols, comes from those merchant sailors who needed a better way to keep accounts and write contracts, 28 centuries ago. They did not intend to revolutionize human communication. They simply needed a tool that worked better than what was available. But in creating that tool, they gave humanity one of its most powerful and enduring inventions. The alphabet is the Phoenicians' truest legacy, the gift that keeps giving across the millennia. connecting the ancient merchant writing an invoice on papyrus to the modern student typing an essay, spanning time through the simple elegance of 22 letters that could say anything that needed to be said. As the Phoenician cities grew in wealth and their maritime expertise deepened, the narrow confines of the Levantine coast began to feel cramped. The hinterland was controlled by larger empires, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, powers that demanded tribute and restricted expansion. But the sea was open, vast, and full of opportunities for those brave and skilled enough to seize them. Beginning around the 10th century BCE and accelerating dramatically in the following centuries, the Phoenicians began to establish colonies throughout the Mediterranean, creating a network of settlements that would transform the ancient world and establish Phoenician culture in places far from the homeland cities. This was not empire in the traditional sense. No central authority directing colonial expansion, no unified Phoenician state conquering territory. Instead, it was a more organic, commercial process, individual cities founding daughter settlements, trading posts evolving into permanent towns, economic opportunity driving expansion. The motivations for colonization were varied and practical. Overpopulation in the homeland cities certainly played a role. Limited agricultural land meant limited carrying capacity, and as populations grew, some people needed to find new homes. Political conflicts might also drive colonization. Losing factions in internal power struggles might choose or be forced to leave and establish themselves elsewhere. But the primary driver was always commercial. The colonies served as permanent trading posts, places where Phoenician merchants could establish warehouses, maintain ships, develop relationships with local populations, and create reliable nodes in increasingly extensive trade networks. Each colony became a link in a chain that eventually stretched from the Levantine coast to the Atlantic shores of Spain and North Africa, transforming the Mediterranean from a barrier into a highway for Phoenician commerce. The process typically began with exploration. A merchant ship, perhaps blown off course, or simply venturing into new waters in search of trade opportunities, would discover a good harbor, investigate the surrounding area, and assess the possibilities. Did local populations have goods worth trading? Was there fresh water available? Was the harbor protected from storms and easily defensible? If the answers were favorable, a report would make its way back to the home city, and a colonizing expedition might be organized. These expeditions were usually privately financed, a group of merchants pooling resources to outfit several ships with colonists, supplies, tools, weapons, and trade goods. The colonists were often younger sons who would not inherit in the homeland, craftsmen seeking better opportunities, merchants looking to establish themselves independently, sometimes slaves or indentured laborers, and occasionally political exiles. The journey itself was an undertaking of extraordinary courage and risk. These expeditions traveled hundreds or even thousands of kilometers across open sea to establish settlements in unknown lands among potentially hostile local populations. They carried everything needed to establish a new community: grain seed for planting, grapevines and olive trees to establish orchards, tools for building and farming, weapons for defense, trade goods to establish economic relationships, and most importantly, cultural and religious items. Statues of the gods, sacred objects, the elements needed to maintain Phoenician identity far from home. Let us trace the arc of Phoenician colonization across the Mediterranean, feeling the scope and ambition of this enterprise. The nearest colonies were established on Cyprus, that large island lying less than 200 kilometers from the Phoenician coast. Here the Phoenicians established the city of Kishan, modern-day Larnaca, which became a major center for copper working, as Cyprus was famous for its copper mines, the very metal that gave the island its name. From Cyprus, expansion continued to Rhodes and other islands of the eastern Aegean, creating stepping stones deeper into the Greek world. These colonies were not just trading posts but proper cities with temples, harbors, and surrounding agricultural land worked by the colonists and sometimes by local populations who entered into various relationships with the new arrivals. Moving west, the Phoenicians established themselves on the large islands of the central Mediterranean. In Sicily, they founded several settlements, though they avoided the eastern part of the island where Greek colonists were establishing their own settlements. The western tip of Sicily became Phoenician territory, with settlements like Motia, built on a small island off the west coast, and heavily fortified as tensions with the Greeks increased. On Sardinia, multiple Phoenician colonies were established, taking advantage of the island's mineral wealth and its strategic position in the western Mediterranean. These Sardinian colonies maintained close connections with the homeland and served as important waypoints for ships traveling further west. But the most important Phoenician colony, the one that would eventually surpass the mother cities themselves in power and wealth, was Carthage. The traditional founding date, preserved in ancient sources, is 814 BCE, though archaeological evidence suggests there may have been a Phoenician presence there slightly earlier. According to legend, Carthage was founded by Dido, also called Alyssa, a princess of Tyre, who fled her home city after her brother, the king, murdered her husband for his wealth. The legend says she arrived on the North African coast and negotiated with the local Berber king for land. She asked for only as much land as could be enclosed by an ox hide, and the king agreed, thinking he was giving away a tiny plot. But Dido cleverly had the ox hide cut into the thinnest possible strips and laid end to end, enclosing a substantial area upon which the new city would be built. Legend aside, Carthage was founded by colonists from Tyre, probably as a planned settlement rather than a gradual trading post-evolution. The location was superb, a peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean with excellent harbors on two sides, fertile hinterland for agriculture, and a strategic position that commanded the narrow waters between Sicily and North Africa. From this beginning, Carthage grew rapidly, attracting additional colonists, developing agriculture and trade, establishing its own colonies, and eventually becoming the dominant power in the western Mediterranean. But in its early centuries, it remained culturally and economically tied to Tyre, one node, albeit an important one, in the broader Phoenician world. Even further west, the Phoenicians pushed beyond the limits of the Mediterranean proper into the uncertain waters of the Atlantic. On the southern coast of Spain, they established Gadir, modern Cadiz, which may be the oldest continuously inhabited city in Western Europe, with archaeological evidence suggesting Phoenician presence as early as the 9th or 8th century BCE. Gadir became the gateway to Atlantic resources, particularly the silver and tin that were unavailable in the eastern Mediterranean. The silver mines of southern Spain were extraordinarily rich, and the Phoenicians developed extensive trading relationships and possibly direct mining operations to access this wealth. Tin, essential for making bronze, was even more precious and apparently came from even more distant sources, possibly Britain or Brittany, though the exact routes and methods of this tin trade remain somewhat mysterious. The Phoenician presence on the Atlantic coast of North Africa is less well documented but probably extensive. There are hints in ancient sources of settlements on the Moroccan coast, possibly ventures even further south along the African coast, though the evidence is fragmentary. What is clear is that the Phoenicians were willing to sail beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, into the Atlantic, something that many ancient peoples considered the edge of the known world. The Atlantic was fundamentally different from the Mediterranean, with stronger currents, higher waves, significant tides, and less predictable weather. But for the skilled Phoenician sailors, these challenges were surmountable, and the rewards in rare resources made the risks worthwhile. The colonies maintained cultural and sometimes political connections to their founding cities, but were essentially independent entities. They would send gifts to the temples in the homeland, celebrate the same religious festivals, maintain the same commercial practices, speak the same language. A Phoenician from Gadir would have felt a kinship with a Phoenician from Tyre, recognized the same gods, understood the same values. Yet Gadir was not ruled by Tyre. It had its own government, made its own decisions, pursued its own interests, though often in coordination with other Phoenician cities. This decentralized network model was quite different from the later Roman or Greek colonial systems, and may have been one of the Phoenicians' sources of resilience. There was no single capital to conquer, no centralized administration to disrupt. Each city could survive the fall of others, could adapt independently to changing circumstances. The relationship between Phoenician colonists and indigenous populations varied greatly depending on location and circumstance. In some places, the Phoenicians established purely trading relationships, exchanging Mediterranean goods, olive oil, wine, fine textiles, weapons for local resources, metals, food products, slaves. In other locations, they intermarried with local populations, creating mixed communities where Phoenician and indigenous cultures blended. The archaeological record shows considerable variation, some sites appearing almost purely Phoenician in their material culture, others showing hybrid forms that suggest cultural mixing. In a few cases there is evidence of conflict, fortifications built against hostile locals, signs of violence and destruction. But overall, the Phoenician expansion seems to have been more commercial than military, more interested in trade than conquest. The typical Phoenician colony consisted of a fortified settlement, usually on a peninsula or small island just offshore where it could be easily defended, with an excellent harbor for the ships that were the colony's lifeblood. Inside the walls were warehouses for storing trade goods, workshops for craftsmen, houses for the inhabitants, and temples to the Phoenician gods, particularly Baal and Astarte, whose worship the colonists maintained faithfully. Outside the walls, if the land was suitable, there would be agricultural fields worked by colonists or local laborers, producing grain, olives, grapes, the staples of Mediterranean diet. But the real wealth of these colonies came from trade, from their position as intermediaries between the Phoenician homeland and the Western Mediterranean, between the civilized East and the resource-rich, less developed West. The goods that flowed through these colonies were diverse. From the East came fine textiles, especially purple-dyed fabrics, manufactured goods, weapons, tools, olive oil, wine, glass, jewelry, essentially the refined products of the more urbanized Eastern Mediterranean. From the West came raw materials, metals especially, but also hides, wool, timber, grain, slaves, amber from the north, and exotic products that the Phoenicians may have obtained from even more distant sources. The colonists themselves became wealthy as middlemen, taking a profit on every transaction, reinvesting in more ships, more warehouses, more trade goods, expanding the network ever outward. By the 6th century BCE, the Phoenician colonial network represented one of the most extensive commercial systems the world had yet seen. A merchant in Tyre could receive silver from Spain, tin from Britain, grain from North Africa, copper from Cyprus, all funneled through the network of Phoenician colonies and ships. Information flowed along these same routes, news of wars and political changes, knowledge of new markets and opportunities, innovations in shipbuilding or navigation. The Mediterranean had become in effect a Phoenician lake, not through military conquest but through commercial dominance, through the patient accumulation of trading posts and the constant movement of purple-sailed ships from harbor to harbor. This colonial expansion was the physical manifestation of Phoenician genius. They had taken their maritime skills, their commercial acumen, their willingness to venture into the unknown, and used these to create a network that connected the entire Mediterranean world. The colonies were not just settlements but nodes in a system, each one adding value, each one extending the reach of Phoenician influence. The mother cities of Tyre, Sidon and Byblos remained important, but increasingly the colonial world took on a life of its own, and one colony in particular, Carthage, was growing into something that would eventually eclipse them all. The colonies and the ships that connected them existed to move goods, and the goods themselves tell us much about the Phoenician world. Let us walk through the warehouses of Tyre or Carthage and see what has been gathered from across the known world, what is waiting to be loaded onto ships for distant markets. The air in these warehouses is a complex mixture of scents, cedar wood and wine, olive oil and dried fish, the musty smell of stored grain, the sharp tang of metal. Everything here represents not just commerce but connection, the physical manifestation of a trading network that spans thousands of kilometers and links dozens of cultures. The most famous Phoenician export we have already encountered: purple-dyed textiles, wool and linen cloth, treated with the precious dye from murex snails, were the luxury product par excellence of the ancient world. These fabrics were shipped throughout the Mediterranean, destined for royal courts and wealthy households from Egypt to Italy. A single bolt of double-dyed purple wool might be worth a small fortune, and the Phoenicians carefully controlled both production and distribution. But purple was not the only textile they traded. They also produced fine linen, woven from flax and valued for its coolness in hot weather. They made wool fabrics dyed in other colors using cheaper methods: reds from madder root, blues from woad, yellows from saffron. The textile industry employed thousands of people, from the shepherds who raised the sheep to the spinners and weavers who produced the cloth, from the dyers whose hands were permanently stained to the merchants who sold the finished products across the sea. Cedar wood from Lebanon was another cornerstone of Phoenician trade. Egypt had been importing Lebanese cedar since the 3rd millennium BCE, using it for ship masts, roof beams, temple doors, and prestigious furniture. The pharaohs paid handsomely for this timber, often in grain, which the Phoenicians desperately needed. Mesopotamian kings also desired cedar, transporting it overland at great cost to build palaces and temples. The Phoenicians not only exported raw timber but also worked cedar into finished products, carved furniture inlaid with ivory, decorative panels, storage chests that would preserve their contents and fill the air with that distinctive cedar scent for generations. The cedar trade was so important that it shaped Phoenician foreign policy. Maintaining good relationships with the powers who controlled the trade routes to major markets was essential to economic survival. The Phoenicians were also master metal workers, and metal goods formed an important part of their trade. They worked bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that was the primary metal for tools and weapons throughout the Bronze and early Iron Ages. Phoenician bronze work was famous for its quality and artistry, mixing Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and unique Phoenician design elements into a distinctive style. They made weapons, swords and daggers and spear points, armor, shields and helmets, tools of all kinds, bowls and cups and elaborate serving vessels that were both functional and beautiful. They worked silver, creating jewelry, drinking vessels, votive offerings for temples. They even worked gold when they could obtain it, though gold was always rare and expensive, reserved for the most prestigious items. Much of this metalwork was not made from locally sourced metal. The copper came from Cyprus, the tin from distant sources in the west, possibly Spain or Britain. The Phoenicians imported raw metal, refined it, alloyed it, and worked it into finished goods that commanded premium prices. Another Phoenician specialty was glass. The exact origin of glassmaking is disputed, with evidence from both Egypt and Mesopotamia, but the Phoenicians certainly perfected and expanded the craft. Early glass was made using a technique called core forming, where molten glass was wound around a removable core to create vessels. This produced relatively small, thick-walled containers, often elaborately decorated with colored patterns. Phoenician glassmakers created beautiful perfume bottles, cosmetic containers, and small drinking vessels in this way. But the real revolution came with the discovery of glass blowing, probably in the 1st century BCE, though possibly earlier. This technique allowed for the creation of larger, thinner-walled, more varied glass objects. Phoenician glass spread throughout the Mediterranean, valued for its beauty and utility, another high-value product from the workshops of Tyre and Sidon. Ivory carving was yet another Phoenician art. The ivory came from elephant tusks, imported from Africa or Syria, a luxury material associated with royalty and the gods. Phoenician craftsmen carved this ivory into decorative panels used to adorn furniture and walls, creating intricate scenes of animals, humans, gods, and geometric patterns. These ivory works often combined Egyptian motifs, Mesopotamian themes, and Phoenician sensibilities into a hybrid style. Archaeological excavations have uncovered Phoenician ivory work from sites across the Mediterranean and Near East, including spectacular finds from the Assyrian palaces at Nimrud, where Phoenician craftsmen either worked on site or exported their finished pieces to Assyrian kings who appreciated fine craftsmanship regardless of its origin. These manufactured goods, textiles, metalwork, glass, carved ivory, were what the Phoenicians primarily exported. But trade is always bilateral, and to understand the full scope of Phoenician commerce, we must consider what they imported, what they needed or desired from other lands. Most basic was grain. The narrow coastal strip of Phoenicia could not produce enough food to support its population, especially as the cities grew and more people devoted themselves to crafts and trade rather than agriculture. Grain had to be imported constantly, from Egypt, from Sicily, from North Africa, from anywhere it could be obtained. This dependence on imported food made the Phoenicians vulnerable, a vulnerability that larger empires would sometimes exploit by threatening to cut off grain supplies unless tribute was paid or other demands met. They also imported raw materials that they lacked locally. Tin was essential for making bronze but was not available in the eastern Mediterranean. The Phoenicians obtained it from the west, from Spain or possibly from as far away as Cornwall in Britain, transporting it back east where it could be alloyed with copper to create bronze. Silver was another critical import, primarily from Spain where the mines were extraordinarily rich. Iron, which was gradually replacing bronze for many purposes during the early 1st millennium BCE, was obtained from various sources, including Asia Minor. The Phoenicians were relatively late to adopt iron technology compared to some neighboring peoples, but eventually they became skilled in working this harder, more versatile metal. From Africa came exotic goods: ivory from elephants, animal hides, ostrich feathers, and possibly gold, though the sources and routes for African gold remain somewhat mysterious. There may have been a silent trade system in operation, mentioned by the Greek historian Herodotus. According to his account, Carthaginian merchants would sail to certain points on the African coast, unload trade goods on the beach, and then return to their ships. Local Africans would come and place gold beside the goods they wished to purchase, then retreat. If the Carthaginians found the amount of gold satisfactory, they would take it and leave. If not, they would wait, and the Africans would add more gold until a price was agreed upon, all without any direct contact or negotiation. Whether this account is accurate or not, it suggests the lengths to which Phoenician traders were willing to go to access rare resources. From the Aegean and later from mainland Greece came pottery, particularly fine painted vessels, and also agricultural products like wine and olive oil. From Egypt came linen, papyrus for writing, and various luxury goods. From Arabia came frankincense and myrrh, the aromatic resins used in religious ceremonies and perfumes, which were valued throughout the ancient world. The Phoenicians served as middlemen for many of these products, buying in one market and selling in another, profiting from their knowledge of what was scarce where and what prices different markets would bear. The organization of this trade was sophisticated. Phoenician merchants maintained warehouses in the major ports, inventory that could be quickly loaded onto ships when profitable opportunities arose. They formed business partnerships, sometimes across multiple cities, pooling resources for large ventures and sharing risks and profits. They developed systems of credit and debt, allowing for transactions that extended over long time periods and vast distances. They used their simplified alphabet to keep detailed accounts, recording every shipment, every sale, every debt owed or paid. The famous Phoenician honesty in business dealings was probably based less on abstract morality than on practical necessity. In a system based on long-distance trade and extended credit, reputation was everything. A merchant known to cheat his partners or clients would find himself excluded from profitable networks. Trust was the oil that allowed the machinery of commerce to function smoothly. The merchant class that orchestrated all of this trade was the true power in Phoenician cities. While there were kings in some periods and councils of elders or aristocratic families in others, the merchants were the ones who generated the wealth that paid for everything else: the temples, the ships, the city walls. These merchants were often also ship owners, investors in multiple vessels, sending them to different markets to spread risk and maximize opportunities. A successful merchant might own a substantial townhouse, employ numerous slaves, maintain trading relationships with partners in a dozen cities. His sons would be educated not just in literacy and mathematics, but in the practical knowledge of trade, learning to judge the quality of goods, to navigate the complexities of different markets, to negotiate effectively. This commercial culture shaped Phoenician values and worldview. They were pragmatists, interested in what worked rather than abstract theory. They were cosmopolitan, accustomed to dealing with people of different cultures and languages, needing to be flexible and adaptable to succeed in diverse markets. They were risk-takers, willing to invest in uncertain ventures, to send ships to distant and dangerous places in pursuit of profit. And they were patient, understanding that the greatest profits came not from quick gains but from building long-term trading relationships and gradually extending networks into new territories. The goods that filled their ships and warehouses were more than just commodities. Each was a link in a vast chain of connections, evidence of the intricate web of relationships that the Phoenicians had woven across the Mediterranean world. That bolt of purple cloth represented not just sheep and snails, but also the shepherds and divers, the spinners and weavers, the dyers who endured the smell, the merchants who knew which distant royal court would pay the highest price. That ingot of tin had traveled perhaps 2,000 kilometers, passing through multiple hands, representing trust between strangers and the accumulated knowledge of profitable trade routes. Those ivory carvings embodied not just artistic skill but also the long journey of African elephants, the dangerous work of hunters, the transport across vast distances, the craftsman's patient work, the wealthy buyer's desire for beauty and status. In the warehouses of the Phoenician cities, the world was gathered and sorted and sent back out again, transformed by commerce into connections between distant peoples who might never meet, but whose lives were linked through the patient work of merchants and the tireless sailing of purple-sailed ships. Yet for all their commercial success and maritime prowess, the Phoenician cities faced a persistent vulnerability. Their position on the eastern Mediterranean coast, that narrow strip between mountain and sea, placed them directly in the path of the great land empires that periodically rose to dominate the Near East. The Phoenicians could control the sea, but the land behind them belonged to others, to powers with vast armies that could threaten destruction unless tribute was paid and submission demonstrated. The story of the Phoenician cities from roughly the 9th century BCE onward is one of carefully navigating between independence and subjugation, using diplomacy, bribery, and their maritime expertise to maintain as much autonomy as possible while formally acknowledging the suzerainty of whichever empire currently dominated the region. The first of these imperial overlords was Assyria, that aggressive militaristic power centered in northern Mesopotamia. The Assyrians were building an empire through conquest, and their armies were the most feared in the ancient world, disciplined, well-equipped, and utterly ruthless in warfare. They developed siege techniques that could overcome even the strongest fortifications, and their policy toward conquered peoples was deliberately terrifying: mass deportations, brutal reprisals against resistance, and public displays of violence designed to discourage rebellion. City after city fell to Assyrian arms, their populations killed or scattered, their wealth looted, their walls torn down. The Phoenician cities watched this expansion with understandable alarm. They were wealthy, which made them attractive targets, but they were also valuable trade partners, which might make conquest less appealing than tribute. When the Assyrians arrived at the borders of Phoenician territory in the 9th century BCE, the Phoenician response was to negotiate. They sent embassies bearing gifts, acknowledged Assyrian overlordship, and agreed to pay annual tribute. This tribute was substantial, literally tons of silver, gold, and precious goods each year, a significant drain on Phoenician wealth, but it was preferable to destruction. The Assyrians, for their part, were satisfied to receive tribute without the expense and risk of actually conquering these cities, especially since Phoenician ships and maritime expertise could be useful to Assyrian interests. This arrangement worked for a time, but the relationship was always tense. The Assyrians were never entirely satisfied, always suspecting that the Phoenicians were holding back wealth, always ready to threaten force to extract more tribute. And there were occasional rebellions when Phoenician cities, perhaps encouraged by some temporary Assyrian weakness or relying on support from Egypt or other powers, would refuse tribute and assert independence. These rebellions rarely ended well. Assyrian records describe multiple campaigns against Phoenician cities, sieges and conquests that brought the rebellious back into line. Yet the Phoenicians usually managed to negotiate terms that preserved their cities and their commercial operations, even in defeat. Their value as tributaries and trade partners gave them leverage that many other conquered peoples lacked. The strategy the Phoenicians developed was one of calculated submission. They would play the role of loyal vassals, sending tribute promptly, providing their ships to serve in Assyrian military campaigns when requested, maintaining diplomatic relations at the highest levels. But they carefully preserved their internal autonomy, their right to govern themselves, to maintain their commercial networks, to worship their own gods. They became experts at the game of imperial politics, knowing when to submit and when to push back, when to send valuable gifts to Assyrian officials, and when to exploit divisions within the Assyrian court. It was an exhausting game, requiring constant attention and significant resources, but it allowed the Phoenician cities to survive as functioning entities while empires rose and fell around them. When Assyria eventually collapsed in the late 7th century BCE, destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, the Phoenicians found themselves subject to a new master, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II was every bit as formidable as the Assyrian kings had been, and he was determined to control the wealthy coastal cities. When Tyre, confident in its island position and massive fortifications, refused submission, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the city. This siege, which lasted 13 years according to ancient sources, became legendary. Tyre, built partly on an island a short distance offshore, was protected by the sea itself. Nebuchadnezzar's armies could control the mainland, could cut off land-based supplies, but they could not easily assault the island portion of the city. Tyre's fleet could bring in supplies by sea, could raid the besiegers, could maintain the city's lifeline even while the siege dragged on year after year. The details of this epic siege are frustratingly sparse. We know it happened. We know it lasted an extraordinarily long time, but we do not know the daily hardships, the military tactics, the moments of crisis or triumph. In the end, some sort of accommodation was reached. Tyre acknowledged Babylonian overlordship and agreed to tribute, but it was not sacked and destroyed. The city's wealth and trade continued, albeit under the watchful eye of Babylonian authorities. Once again, the Phoenicians had survived subjugation through a combination of resistance and negotiation, maintaining their essential character even while formally submitting to foreign power. The Persian Empire, which conquered Babylon in 539 BCE and inherited its territories, treated the Phoenician cities more favorably. The Persian kings Cyrus, Darius and their successors were building the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from India to the Mediterranean, and they needed the Phoenician fleet. The Persians were primarily a land power. Their armies could conquer vast territories, but they had limited naval capabilities. The Phoenician ships and sailors became an essential element of Persian military power, particularly in the western part of the empire where control of the sea was critical. In return for providing their fleet, the Phoenician cities received significant autonomy. They kept their own kings and councils, maintained their commercial networks, paid tribute, but were not heavily garrisoned or closely supervised. The relationship with Persia was probably the best arrangement the Phoenicians had with any empire. They served as the Persian navy, sailing on expeditions to support Persian military campaigns, including the ill-fated invasions of Greece in 490 and 480 BCE. Phoenician ships were prominent in the great naval battles of Artemisium and Salamis, fighting on the Persian side against the Greek fleets. But this military service was compensated by real privileges. The Phoenician cities prospered under Persian rule, their trade networks expanded, and they maintained a level of independence that would have been impossible under Assyrian or Babylonian domination. Yet even this relatively benign imperial relationship had costs. The tribute, though perhaps less burdensome than under Assyria, still flowed from Phoenician treasuries to Persian coffers. Phoenician ships and sailors were regularly requisitioned for Persian military needs, taking them away from profitable trade, and the Phoenicians were always aware that their autonomy was conditional, dependent on Persian power and Persian goodwill. If the empire weakened or changed policy, their position could deteriorate rapidly. The Phoenicians also developed a sophisticated diplomatic strategy of playing larger powers against each other. When Assyria was strong, they might quietly cultivate relationships with Egypt, positioning themselves to shift allegiance if Assyrian power waned. During the Persian period, some Phoenician cities maintained contact with Greek states, hedging their bets in case the political situation changed. This was dangerous politics, requiring skill, secrecy, and accurate information about the shifting balance of power. A miscalculation could bring destruction, but successful diplomacy could preserve autonomy and profit. The experience of living under successive empires shaped Phoenician political culture. They learned that survival required flexibility, that pride and independence were luxuries they could not always afford, that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally. They became pragmatic to the point of cynicism, viewing political relationships as transactions, morality as secondary to survival and profit. This earned them a reputation among the Greeks and others as untrustworthy, as people who would change sides for advantage, who honored contracts only when convenient. There is probably some truth to this characterization, though it might better be understood as the necessary adaptation of a small maritime culture surrounded by much larger land powers. The Phoenicians did what they needed to do to survive, and they survived for nearly 2,000 years in one form or another, outlasting empires that seemed far more powerful. The delicate balance the Phoenicians maintained, subject yet independent, tributary yet prosperous, was ultimately sustainable only as long as the empires they served remained relatively stable and continued to value Phoenician maritime capabilities. When that balance was disrupted, when a power arose that was willing to bear the cost of fully conquering Phoenician cities, and did not need their willing cooperation, the Phoenician world would face its greatest crisis. That disruption would come in the form of a young Macedonian king named Alexander, whose ambitions and military genius would reshape the entire eastern Mediterranean world and end the independence of the Phoenician cities forever. In the spring of 332 BCE, Alexander the Great of Macedon arrived at the gates of Tyre, with an army that had just conquered the Persian Empire's western provinces in an astonishing series of victories. He was 24 years old, driven by ambition that knew no bounds, leading the finest army in the world, and he was on his way to Egypt. His demand to the Tyrians was simple, and he thought reasonable. He wished to enter their city and make sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, whom the Greeks identified with their hero Heracles. It was a diplomatic gesture, an opportunity for Tyre to peacefully acknowledge the new power in the region. The Tyrians' response was cautious but fatal. They were willing to acknowledge Alexander's authority, to provide supplies, to pay tribute if necessary. But they would not allow his army inside their city walls. Instead, they suggested he could make his sacrifice at the temple of Melkart on the mainland, in the ruins of old Tyre. The refusal was understandable. Tyre had survived for centuries by carefully guarding its independence, by never allowing foreign armies within its defenses. The city was virtually impregnable, built on an island about a kilometer from the shore, surrounded by massive walls rising directly from the sea, defended by one of the best navies in the Mediterranean. For more than 2,000 years, no enemy had successfully taken Tyre by assault. The city had survived the 13-year siege by Nebuchadnezzar. It could surely outlast this young Macedonian king. Alexander did not see it that way. The refusal was an insult to his dignity and a strategic threat to his campaign. As long as Tyre remained independent and in possession of its powerful fleet, it could serve as a base for Persian counterattacks, could threaten his supply lines, could encourage other cities to resist. Tyre had to be conquered, not just for military reasons but to make an example, to show all the cities of the coast that resistance to Alexander was futile. He announced that he would take the city, and his engineers began surveying the situation. What they faced seemed impossible. The island of Tyre lay hundreds of meters offshore, protected by deep water and strong currents. The walls were massive, built of stone blocks and rising many meters above the sea. The Tyrians had ships and skilled sailors who could harass any force trying to approach. How do you besiege an island when you have no fleet? Alexander's solution was audacious to the point of madness. He would build a causeway, a mole extending from the mainland to the island, creating a land bridge across the open water. His army would literally build a road to Tyre across the sea itself. The engineers marked out the route, and the soldiers began the work. They demolished the ruins of old Tyre on the mainland and used the rubble as fill. They sank wooden pilings into the seafloor to create a framework, then piled stones and earth between them. As the causeway extended from shore, the work became harder. The water grew deeper, the currents stronger. The Tyrians were not passive observers. They sailed out in warships and rained arrows and catapult missiles on the workers. They sent fireships, vessels filled with flammable material, set ablaze and sailed into the wooden structures, burning parts of the causeway and killing the workers. Alexander responded with typical resourcefulness. He had siege towers built on the causeway itself, tall wooden structures from which his archers could return fire and protect the workers. He sent to the allied cities of Cyprus and Phoenicia, cities that had submitted to him, demanding that they send their fleets to join his cause. Gradually, ships began to arrive, attracted by Alexander's obvious power or compelled by his threats. Soon he had assembled a fleet of more than 200 ships, outnumbering and outclassing the Tyrian navy. The balance of power shifted. Tyrian ships could no longer safely approach the causeway. Alexander's fleet could blockade the island, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. Month after month, the siege continued. The causeway inched forward, and it grew wider and more solid. The Macedonian siege engines, the most advanced of the age, were brought up. Massive catapults hurled stones at Tyre's walls. Battering rams were mounted on ships and driven against the fortifications at the waterline. The Tyrians fought desperately, repairing damage each night, making sorties against Alexander's fleet, using every defensive trick they knew. They dropped massive stones into the water to prevent ships from approaching, poured burning sand from the walls that would work its way inside the armor of attacking soldiers and burn their flesh, used ingenious devices to grab and overturn the Macedonian rams. The defenders knew that surrender meant slavery at best, massacre at worst. They had no choice but to resist to the end. After 7 months of siege, The causeway finally reached the island. Alexander's siege engines were brought up, and a section of the southern wall was breached. Simultaneously, his fleet stormed the harbors on the north and south sides of the city, overwhelming the Tyrian ships and forcing entrance. Macedonian soldiers poured through the breach in the wall and through the captured harbors. The final assault was a massacre. The Tyrians fought in the streets, on the walls, in their homes, but they were overwhelmed. Alexander, furious at the length of the resistance and the casualties he had suffered, gave orders that reflected his rage. The Greek sources claim that 8,000 Tyrian men were killed in the fighting and the immediate aftermath. 30,000 men, women and children were sold into slavery. 2,000 men of military age were crucified on the beach as a warning to any other city contemplating resistance. Tyre, the great city that had stood for millennia, that had survived Assyrians and Babylonians, was conquered and broken. The causeway that Alexander built remained, gradually widening as sand and sediment accumulated, until eventually the island became a permanent part of the mainland, which it remains today. The city was resettled, continued to exist as a regional center, but it was never again the independent Phoenician power it had been. Its fall marked a turning point, the end of Phoenician political independence in the Levantine homeland. The other major Phoenician cities had already submitted to Alexander without resistance, seeing the futility of opposing his power. Sidon had welcomed him, eager for revenge against Tyre, which had been its rival. Byblos opened its gates. The Phoenician cities of the Levant became part of Alexander's empire, and after his death, they would be parceled out among his successors, fought over, passed from dynasty to dynasty, but never again truly independent. The Phoenician homeland had become a periphery of larger empires, important for its ports and trade, but no longer a significant political actor. Yet the fall of the Levantine cities did not mean the end of Phoenician civilization. Far to the west, Carthage had grown into a great power in its own right, the dominant force in the western Mediterranean. While Tyre was falling to Alexander, Carthage was expanding its own empire, controlling much of North Africa, southern Spain, Sardinia, western Sicily, and more. The Carthaginians were Phoenicians in culture and language, descendants of colonists from Tyre, maintaining the same gods, the same commercial practices, the same maritime traditions. In Carthage, Phoenician civilization would endure and even flourish for another 5 centuries, until it too would face an enemy determined on total destruction. But that is another chapter, another story of rise and fall, triumph and tragedy, playing out in the western Mediterranean, even as the eastern Phoenician cities passed into history. The Siege of Tyre by Alexander remains one of the most remarkable military operations of ancient history. 7 months of intensive siege work, the construction of an extraordinary causeway, the assembly of a massive fleet, the application of the most advanced siege technology of the age, all to conquer a single city. It demonstrated both Alexander's determination and engineering capability, and the Tyrians' courage and skill in defense. But it also marked the end of an era. The small independent city-states that had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries could not survive in a world of great territorial empires, led by military geniuses with seemingly unlimited ambition. The age of the Phoenician cities as independent powers was over, ended not by gradual decline but by violent conquest, buried under the rubble of Alexander's causeway and the weight of his empire. Now let us turn our attention westward, across the Mediterranean to North Africa, where the Phoenician legacy lived on in a new and powerful form. Carthage had begun as a colony of Tyre, one settlement among many in the Phoenician network. But by the 4th century BCE, as the Levantine cities fell under the control of successive empires, Carthage had become something far greater, a true empire in its own right, the most powerful state in the western Mediterranean and the last great expression of Phoenician civilization. The story of Carthage is in many ways the story of the Phoenician world writ large, a tale of maritime commerce, colonial expansion, cultural adaptation, and eventually, catastrophic conflict with a rising power that would tolerate no rivals. The Carthaginians called themselves Canaanites, the same name that the Levantine Phoenicians used for themselves, a clear indication of their sense of continuity with the homeland. They spoke Punic, the western dialect of Phoenician, worshipped the same gods under slightly different names, and maintained many of the same cultural practices. Yet Carthage was also distinctly different from the Levantine cities, shaped by its North African environment and its more militaristic history. Where Tyre and Sidon had survived through diplomacy and tribute to great empires, Carthage had no larger power to submit to in its region. It had to defend itself through military strength. Where the Levantine cities had been content with trade and small colonies, Carthage built a territorial empire, controlling substantial hinterland in North Africa and conquering or dominating large portions of Sicily, Sardinia, and southern Spain. The wealth of Carthage was staggering, built on the same foundation as the Levantine cities, but on a grander scale. The city controlled rich agricultural lands in North Africa, the famous fields that would later make the region the breadbasket of Rome. These lands were worked by a mix of free tenant farmers and slaves, producing grain, olives, wine and other crops for export. Carthage also inherited and expanded the Phoenician trading networks in the west, controlling the flow of Spanish silver, African gold and ivory, Sardinian metals, and countless other goods. The city itself was magnificently fortified with massive walls, a population that may have reached several 100,000 at its peak, and harbors that were marvels of ancient engineering, including a circular military harbor that could house hundreds of warships under cover, protected from observation and attack. The Carthaginian government was similar to the Phoenician model, an oligarchic republic dominated by merchant aristocrats. There was an executive office held by 2 annually elected suffetes, similar to the Roman consuls, a senate of powerful families, and a popular assembly that had some voice though little real power. Like the Levantine cities, Carthage was ruled by and for its commercial elite, people whose wealth came from trade and who shaped policy to protect and expand their economic interests. The system was stable and generally effective, though prone to the same factional struggles that affected all oligarchies, with different families and interest groups competing for power and influence. Carthaginian religion maintained strong connections to Phoenician tradition. They worshipped Baal Hammon, a form of the ancient Phoenician god Baal, and Tanit, a goddess similar to Astarte, associated with fertility and the moon. The main temple of Tanit in Carthage was said to be one of the wealthiest religious institutions in the ancient world, filled with votive offerings, precious metals, and the accumulated treasure of centuries. And it is with Carthaginian religion that we encounter one of the most controversial aspects of Phoenician culture, the practice that ancient sources describe as child sacrifice. The Tophet, a burial ground containing the cremated remains of very young children and animals, excavated in Carthage and some other Phoenician sites, has been the subject of intense scholarly debate. Were these children sacrificed to the gods in times of crisis, or were they simply infants who died naturally and were given special burial? The ancient sources, mainly Greek and Roman, unanimously assert that the Carthaginians practiced child sacrifice, offering their own children to Baal Hammon and Tanit in times of crisis. But these sources were often hostile, written by enemies looking to portray the Carthaginians as barbarians. Modern archaeology cannot definitively resolve the question. What is clear is that if such practices occurred, they were probably exceptional responses to extreme danger, not routine religious activity. The expansion of Carthaginian power inevitably brought conflict with other peoples competing for control of the Western Mediterranean. The Greeks had been establishing their own colonies in Sicily and southern Italy since the 8th century BCE, and the Sicilian Greeks and the Carthaginians fought a series of wars for control of that large and fertile island. These wars were brutal and indecisive, with control shifting back and forth, cities besieged and sacked, thousands killed or enslaved, and neither side able to achieve lasting dominance. The Carthaginians controlled the western third of Sicily, the Greeks the eastern regions, and the struggle between them would continue for centuries. But the conflict that would ultimately doom Carthage came from an unexpected direction. On the Italian mainland, a city that had once been minor and insignificant was growing into a major power. Rome, originally just one city-state among many in Italy, had gradually conquered its neighbors and unified the Italian peninsula under its control. By the mid-3rd century BCE, Rome was a formidable military power with a large population, excellent infantry, and growing ambitions. The Romans looked across the narrow straits to Sicily, wealthy and divided, ripe for conquest. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE over control of Sicily, and it would last for 23 years, one of the longest continuous wars in ancient history. The conflict was primarily naval, fought with fleets of hundreds of ships clashing in great battles that killed tens of thousands. Rome, which had virtually no naval tradition, had to learn seacraft from scratch, copying captured Carthaginian ships and training crews through sheer determination. The Romans developed an ingenious device called the corvus, a boarding ramp that could be dropped onto enemy ships, turning naval battles into land battles where Roman infantry superiority could be decisive. Through a combination of innovation, determination, and sheer bloody-minded persistence, the Romans gradually gained the upper hand. After 23 years of war, Carthage was forced to surrender Sicily, pay a massive indemnity, and cede control of the seas around Italy. It was a devastating blow, but Carthage survived. The Second Punic War, which began in 218 BCE, was Carthage's attempt at revenge, and it came close to destroying Rome. The Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, one of the greatest military commanders in history, conceived an audacious strategy. Rather than fight the Romans in Sicily or at sea where they had proven strong, he would attack Italy itself by land, marching an army from Spain, through Gaul, and over the Alps, appearing in northern Italy, where the Romans least expected him. The march was a logistical nightmare, crossing rivers and mountains with an army that included war elephants, fighting hostile tribes, enduring terrible weather and starvation. Nearly half the army was lost. But Hannibal succeeded, reaching Italy with enough forces to take the war directly to Roman territory. For 15 years, Hannibal campaigned in Italy, winning battle after battle against Roman armies, destroying legion after legion. At Cannae in 216 BCE, he inflicted the worst defeat in Roman history, surrounding and annihilating an army of 70,000 men in a single day. Yet Rome refused to surrender, refused even to negotiate. The Romans implemented a strategy of attrition, avoiding major battles with Hannibal's army while attacking Carthaginian allies and possessions elsewhere. They invaded Spain, conquered Carthaginian territories there, and eventually, in a brilliant stroke, landed an army in North Africa itself, directly threatening Carthage. Hannibal was forced to return home to defend the city, and at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, he was finally defeated by the Roman general Scipio Africanus. Carthage had to sue for peace, surrender Spain and all territories outside Africa, hand over its fleet and elephants, and pay an enormous indemnity over 50 years. The great Phoenician Empire was broken, reduced to a wealthy but powerless city-state. For 50 years, Carthage paid its tribute to Rome and rebuilt its prosperity through trade and agriculture. It had been disarmed, no longer a military threat to anyone. But its wealth continued to grow, its commerce flourished, its fields produced abundantly. In Rome there were those who looked at Carthaginian recovery with alarm and hatred. The most famous was Cato the Elder, a Roman senator who famously ended every speech, regardless of the topic, with the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BCE, seizing on a minor pretext, Rome declared the Third Punic War. The Carthaginians tried desperately to appease Rome, offering surrender, offering to disarm completely, offering hostages. But Rome demanded the impossible, that the Carthaginians abandon their city and relocate at least 15 kilometers inland away from the sea. For a Phoenician people, for whom the sea was life itself, this was unacceptable. Carthage chose to fight. The final siege lasted 3 years. The Carthaginians, who had disarmed under Roman threats, frantically rearmed, melting down metal from temples and homes to make weapons, cutting women's hair to make ropes for catapults. They held out with desperate courage, defending every street, every house. But in 146 BCE, the Roman army breached the final defenses and poured into the city. What followed was one of history's great acts of destruction. The city was systematically sacked, its population killed or enslaved, its buildings torn down and burned. Ancient sources claim the city burned for 17 days. When the fire finally died, the Romans are said to have plowed the ground and sowed it with salt, though this may be legend, a symbolic gesture representing the utter destruction of Carthage. What is certain is that Carthage was deliberately and completely destroyed, erased as a political and cultural entity, its people scattered or enslaved, its wealth looted, its very name to become synonymous with absolute defeat. The destruction of Carthage was also the destruction of the last independent Phoenician state. For 3,000 years, from the Bronze Age cities of the Levantine coast to the Empire of Carthage, Phoenician culture had survived, adapted, and often thrived. Now it was ended. not through gradual assimilation or decline, but through violent annihilation, deliberate cultural genocide carried out by a rival power that would tolerate no competition. The Phoenician language gradually faded from use, replaced by Latin in the west and Greek and Aramaic in the east. The gods were forgotten or absorbed into other pantheons. The distinctive cultural practices dissolved into the broader Greco-Roman world. Within a few centuries, the Phoenicians had become a historical footnote, remembered primarily through the hostile accounts of their enemies, their own voices permanently silenced. Yet even in destruction, the Phoenician legacy persisted. The alphabet continued to spread and evolve. The trading networks and commercial practices they had pioneered became standard throughout the Mediterranean world. The cities they founded, places like Cadiz and Palermo, Carthage itself, which Rome would rebuild as a Roman city, continued to thrive. And in the genetic makeup of Mediterranean populations, in the cultural memories of coastal peoples, in the very structure of commerce and language, the Phoenicians remained, transformed but not entirely gone. They had not built monuments to rival the pyramids or created philosophies to match the Greeks. But they had connected the ancient world, carried goods and ideas across vast distances, given humanity tools like the alphabet that would prove more enduring than any empire. The last Phoenician state had fallen, but its echoes would continue to resonate through history, subtle but indelible, the legacy of the masters of the sea. And so we come to the end of our journey through the Phoenician world, from the cedar forests of Lebanon to the burning ruins of Carthage, from the first tentative voyages along the Levantine coast to the great trading networks that spanned the Mediterranean and beyond. What remains of this remarkable civilization? What traces can still be found by those who know where to look? The physical legacy is scattered, but significant. Along the Lebanese coast, the ancient Phoenician cities still exist, though transformed by millennia of continuous habitation. Modern Byblos, Jebel in Arabic, contains archaeological layers stretching back to the Neolithic period, with Phoenician-era temples, harbors, and fortifications visible among the ruins. Tyre and Sidon remain inhabited cities, their ancient harbors silted but still identifiable, their Phoenician and Roman layers excavated and partially preserved. Standing in these places, you can still sense the connection to that ancient maritime culture, can almost see the purple-sailed ships that once filled these harbors. The causeway that Alexander built to conquer Tyre remains visible, though now it is a permanent isthmus connecting what was once an island to the mainland, widened by centuries of sediment accumulation, built over with modern structures. It is one of history's most enduring siege works, a monument to both Alexander's determination and Tyre's resistance, transforming the very geography of the coastline. Across the Mediterranean, wherever the Phoenicians established colonies, traces remain. In Cadiz, Spain, one of the oldest cities in Western Europe, archaeological excavations have uncovered Phoenician tombs and artifacts, though much of the ancient city lies beneath the modern metropolis. On the islands of Sicily and Sardinia, Phoenician inscriptions and ruins mark the sites of ancient settlements. The Topet at ancient Carthage, controversial as it is, can still be visited. Thousands of small urns containing cremated remains, inscribed stones recording dedicatory offerings, a haunting connection to Phoenician religious practices. In museums around the Mediterranean world, Phoenician artifacts are displayed. Carved ivory panels showing the distinctive hybrid style that mixed Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Phoenician motifs. Glass vessels, some still gleaming with their original colors. Bronze bowls decorated with intricate scenes. Inscriptions in the Phoenician alphabet. Most frustratingly brief, dedicatory texts or merchants' marks, rarely giving us the historical narratives or literary works we desperately wish had survived. Jewelry showing sophisticated metalwork techniques. Anchors and ship fittings, silent testimony to their maritime prowess. Each artifact tells a small part of the story, and together they begin to paint a picture of this lost civilization, though it remains a picture with many gaps and uncertainties. Perhaps the most visible Phoenician legacy, though we rarely think of it this way, is linguistic. The alphabet you are reading now, the letters that form these words, descended through Latin and various medieval scripts from the Greek alphabet, which in turn was adapted from the Phoenician. The connection is not just historical, but visible in the letter forms themselves. Our letter A is the Greek alpha, is the Phoenician aleph, that simplified ox head. B is beta, is Beth. The shapes have evolved almost beyond recognition, but the underlying system remains, a small set of simple symbols representing sounds, the Phoenician innovation that democratized literacy and transformed human communication. Every time someone writes in Latin alphabet, Cyrillic, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, or any of the other alphabetic scripts descended from or influenced by the Phoenician system, they are using a tool created by those ancient merchants who needed an easier way to keep accounts and write letters. The genetic legacy is also significant, though difficult to quantify precisely. Modern population genetic studies have identified markers associated with Phoenician colonization throughout the Mediterranean. Coastal populations in Lebanon, Tunisia, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and other areas of ancient Phoenician settlement show genetic signatures suggesting descent from or admixture with Phoenician colonists. The Phoenicians did not arrive in empty lands. They interacted, traded, and intermarried with indigenous populations, and the genetic traces of those interactions persist 3 millennia later. In a very literal sense, the Phoenicians are not entirely gone but survive in the DNA of millions of Mediterranean people. What has been lost is immeasurably greater than what survives. We have no Phoenician literature, no epic poems, no histories written from their perspective, no philosophical treatises, no scientific works. If such things existed, and surely they did, they are gone, destroyed in the many conquests and sacks that Phoenician cities endured, decomposed when written on perishable materials like papyrus and leather, or simply never copied and preserved as Greek and Roman works were. We know the Phoenicians primarily through the eyes of others, through Greek and Roman writers, who often viewed them as commercial rivals and cultural inferiors, whose accounts are colored by prejudice and limited understanding. The voices of the Phoenicians themselves, their own stories and perspectives, their literature and poetry, their jokes and wisdom, all of that is silent, leaving a gap in our understanding that can never be fully filled. Imagine what we have lost. 3,000 years of accumulated experience of the sea, of navigation and shipbuilding and maritime commerce, the accounts of voyages to distant places, descriptions of peoples and lands that might settle some of our lingering historical questions. Did they reach Britain in search of tin? Did they sail down the African coast? Did they, as some ancient sources hint, even cross the Atlantic, millennia before Columbus? We will probably never know with certainty. The knowledge of how purple dye was precisely produced, the exact techniques and timing that master dyers used, the religious texts and myths, the stories that Phoenician parents told their children, the songs that sailors sang to pass the time on long voyages, the political debates in city councils, the personal letters between merchants, the intimate details of daily life that make historical peoples come alive for us. All of that is lost, leaving the Phoenicians as shadowy figures, known for what they did but not for who they were. Yet perhaps there is something appropriate about this silence, something that fits the character of the Phoenicians as we understand them. They were not a people who built monuments to themselves or who sought glory and recognition. They were merchants and sailors, practical people focused on the immediate needs of trade and survival. They left behind no pyramids or ziggurats, no massive temples carved into mountainsides, no grandiose proclamations of divine kingship. Their monuments were ships that rotted, trade goods that were consumed, colonies that became independent or were conquered. Their legacy was meant to be functional, not symbolic. The alphabet was not created as a grand cultural achievement, but as a practical tool for commerce. The colonies were established not for imperial glory but for economic advantage. Even their art, beautiful and skillful as it was primarily made for export, to sell to other peoples rather than to express Phoenician identity. In this sense, the Phoenicians were perhaps the first truly modern commercial culture, valuing practical results over symbolic gestures, adapting flexibly to circumstances rather than adhering rigidly to tradition, cosmopolitan and pragmatic rather than parochial and ideological. They succeeded not through military conquest or religious fervor, but through skill, hard work, innovation, and an almost obsessive focus on what worked. That such a culture left few monuments and little literature is perhaps not surprising. They were too busy sailing, trading, building, creating wealth to worry much about how they would be remembered by distant future generations. And yet they are remembered, not as they might have wished to be remembered, telling their own story in their own words, but filtered through the accounts of others, pieced together from archaeological fragments, inferred from the legacies they left without intending them as legacies. We remember them as the inventors of the alphabet, though they probably thought of it as just a useful tool. We remember them as great sailors, which they would have understood and appreciated. We remember them as the purple traders, though that was just one product among many. We remember Carthage's tragic end, though most of the Phoenician story happened elsewhere and earlier. We remember them incompletely, with gaps and uncertainties, but we remember them nonetheless. The Mediterranean today is very different from the sea. The Phoenicians knew. Modern shipping has transformed it from a frontier into a highway. Satellites and GPS have made navigation trivial. Political borders and national identities have redrawn the map. Yet something of the Phoenician spirit persists in the maritime cultures of the Mediterranean coast, in the small ports where fishing boats still head out at dawn, in the markets where goods are bought and sold with animated negotiation, in the cosmopolitan mixing of peoples and cultures that has always characterized Mediterranean civilization. The sea that was the Phoenicians' highway, their farm, their fortress, and their fate continues to connect the diverse peoples around its shores, facilitating commerce and cultural exchange just as it did 3,000 years ago. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander back to that ancient harbor where our journey began, to the pre-dawn stillness and the gradual awakening of a Phoenician city. The ships are being prepared for departure, provisions loaded, sails checked, prayers offered to the gods of sea and wind. Merchants are finalizing their plans, calculating profits, assessing risks. Craftsmen are in their workshops, producing the goods that will fill the ship's holds. Ordinary people are beginning their daily routines, unaware that they are part of a civilization that will be remembered millennia hence, though not in the way they might have imagined. The sun rises over the mountains, its light touching the water and turning it from gray to bronze to brilliant blue. The ships catch the morning breeze and begin to move, their purple sails filling, their painted eyes watching the horizon. They are heading west, towards Cyprus or Crete or Sicily or some even more distant destination, carrying cedar and purple cloth, glass and metalwork, connecting the ancient world one voyage at a time. The Phoenicians are gone, yet they remain, present in the letters you read, in the cities that grew from their colonies, in the genetic heritage of Mediterranean peoples, in the very concept of long-distance maritime trade. They were the masters of the sea, those merchant sailors who turned geographic limitation into commercial dominance, who survived for 3,000 years, not through military might, but through skill, adaptability, and an unwavering focus on the possible. Their voices are silent now, their ships rotted away, their cities conquered or transformed beyond recognition. But the routes they charted, the connections they made, the innovations they pioneered, continue to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. They sail on, those purple-sailed ships, in memory and legacy, in the letters you are reading, and the trade networks that still connect distant shores, in the human capacity to look at an obstacle and see an opportunity, at a barrier and imagine a bridge. And so our voyage through the ancient past comes to a close. We have walked the harbors of Tyre and Sidon, sailed with merchant vessels across the open Mediterranean, witnessed the creation of purple dye and the invention of the alphabet, followed the expansion of colonies from Cyprus to Cadiz, watched empires rise and fall around the Phoenician cities, and witnessed the final destruction of Carthage. We have encountered a people who left few written records but whose impact on history was profound and lasting, who were not conquerors but connectors, not warriors but merchants, not ideologues but pragmatists. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of the Phoenicians. May you rest well, and may your dreams carry you to distant shores and ancient harbors, to a time when the Mediterranean was young and the horizon held both danger and promise, when the masters of the sea sailed purple-sailed ships into the unknown and connected the ancient world. Good night, and sleep well.